Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and let your breathing slow to match the gentle rhythm of time itself. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey far deeper into the past than you might imagine possible, back over 5,000 years to the very cradle of human civilization. In the ancient land between two rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates flow through what we now call Iraq, the world's first cities rose from fertile mud. The Sumerians. Even their name carries the weight of ages, doesn't it? These remarkable people, whose lives unfolded in the shadow of ziggurats and along the banks of life-giving canals, gave us so much of what we consider fundamental to human society. Writing, cities, laws, the wheel, the concept of time divided into hours and minutes, mathematics, literature. But tonight, we won't simply list their achievements like items in a museum catalog. Instead, imagine yourself walking in their footsteps, breathing the warm, dusty air of ancient Mesopotamia, hearing the gentle splash of irrigation water and the distant call of merchants in the marketplace. Let the rhythm of their daily lives carry you deeper into rest, as we explore not just what the Sumerians accomplished, but how they lived, loved, worked, and dreamed in humanity's first great experiment with civilization. The sun is setting over the ancient city of Ur, casting long shadows across mud brick walls that have stood for millennia. The day's heat is finally breaking, and a gentle breeze carries the scent of date palms and the distant aroma of barley bread baking in clay ovens. This is where our journey begins, in the everyday moments that shape the foundation of human culture. Picture yourself awakening before dawn in a modest home in the great city of Uruk. Around 3000 BCE, the walls around you are thick mud brick, still holding the coolness of night against the coming heat of day. Through the small, high windows, you can hear the city stirring to life, the soft shuffle of sandaled feet on packed earth, the gentle lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the rhythmic thump of grain being ground in stone mortar by your neighbors. Your bed is simple, a reed mat placed on a raised platform of mud brick, with perhaps a wooden headrest if you're fortunate enough to belong to a craft family. The floor beneath is packed earth, swept clean, and sometimes covered with woven reed mats that your wife or mother created during the long, hot afternoons when outdoor work became impossible. The first task of each day belongs to water. In this land between rivers, water is life itself, channeled through an intricate network of canals that thread through the city like veins, carrying blood through a body. You step outside into the gradually lightening sky, joining the quiet procession of neighbors making their way to the communal well or the nearest canal branch. The air is soft and still, carrying the earthy scent of mud and the sweet fragrance of date palms that line the waterways. The rhythm of drawing water is ancient and meditative, the creak of rope against wood, the splash as the leather bucket meets the surface, the gentle strain in your shoulders as you pull up the day's supply. Around you, others move through the same ritual, their voices low and comfortable in the pre-dawn quiet. Children help their mothers, learning the essential skills that will sustain them throughout their lives. Water secured, you return home as the first golden light begins to touch the tops of the ziggurats that dominate your city's skyline. These massive stepped pyramids, rising like artificial mountains from the flat Mesopotamian plain, serve as the dwelling places of the gods and the centers of civic life. Even from your humble neighborhood, you can see the morning procession of priests climbing the steep stairs to perform the daily rituals that keep the divine order in balance. Your breakfast is simple but nourishing barley porridge, prepared by your wife, perhaps flavored with dates or onions, accompanied by flat bread baked on a clay griddle. If your family has been blessed with good fortune, there might be a small portion of cheese made from goat's milk, or even a few dried fish from the rivers. You eat slowly, sitting on a low stool in your home's main room, surrounded by the clay vessels and woven baskets that hold your family's possessions. The pottery around you tells the story of human ingenuity smooth, Well-fired vessels created on the potter's wheel, one of your people's great innovations. Some bear the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform writing, perhaps recording the contents or the name of the vessel's maker. These marks represent something revolutionary in human history, the ability to preserve thoughts and information beyond the fragility of memory. As the sun climbs higher, you prepare for the day's work. If you're a farmer, you'll join the communal effort to maintain the irrigation channels that bring life to the fields. The work is methodical and satisfying, clearing debris from canal beds, reinforcing earthen banks, adjusting the wooden gates that control water flow. Your tools are simple but effective. Bronze-bladed hoes, wooden shovels, baskets woven from reeds that grow in the marshy areas where the rivers slow and spread. The fields themselves stretch in neat rectangles between the canals, geometric patterns imposed on the natural landscape through human will and cooperation. Barley and wheat wave in the gentle breeze, their grain heads heavy with the promise of harvest. Date palms provide shade and sweet fruit, their fronds rustling with a sound like distant rain. The irrigation ditches reflect the sky, creating a landscape of earth, water, and growing things that speaks to humanity's first successful partnership with nature. If you're a craftsman, your day unfolds in the cool interior of a workshop, your hands shaping clay or metal or wood into objects of beauty and utility. The potter's wheel turns slowly beneath your palms as you coax a vessel into being, the clay cool and responsive, transforming from formless earth into something that will serve your community for years to come. The metalworker's forge glows with controlled fire, bronze melting and flowing into molds that will create tools, weapons, and ornaments of surprising sophistication. The textile workers, mostly women, gather in the shade of courtyards, their fingers working with practiced efficiency as they spin thread from flax and wool, weave fabric on looms, and create the garments that clothe your people. Their work is accompanied by soft conversation and traditional songs, the rhythm of their labor matching the ancient melodies that help pass the long hours of detailed work. Children move through this world with the easy adaptation of youth, learning through observation and gradual participation. Young boys help their fathers in the fields or workshops, their small hands learning to guide the plow or shape the clay. Girls work alongside their mothers, mastering the arts of food preparation, textile work, and household management. But childhood in Sumer also includes play clay toys shaped like animals, simple board games scratched into stone surfaces, and the universal pleasure of splashing in the canals during the hottest part of the day. The marketplace forms the beating heart of your city, a space where the products of countless hands change ownership through the ancient arc of trade. Merchants spread their wares on woven mats or display them in large clay jars. The air is thick with mingled scents, the sharp tang of onions and garlic, the sweetness of dates and figs, the earthy aroma of grain, the more exotic fragrances of spices brought from distant lands by brave traders who risk the dangers of desert travel. Bartering requires skill and patience. You might trade a portion of your barley harvest for a new bronze knife, or exchange a day's labor for a piece of pottery your wife needs. The negotiations are conducted with ritual courtesy, each party taking time to examine the goods, discuss their quality, and arrive at terms that satisfy both sides. The process is social as much as economic, strengthening the bonds that hold your community together. As the afternoon heat intensifies, the pace of life slows naturally. People retreat to the shade of their homes or the shelter of covered courtyards. This is the time for the quieter arts, the scribe practicing his cuneiform on clay tablets, the mother teaching her daughter to identify useful plants, the grandfather telling stories that preserve the memory of ancestors and the wisdom of ages. The stories speak of heroes like Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, whose adventures carry him beyond the boundaries of the known world in search of immortality. They tell of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, who descended into the underworld and returned transformed. These tales, passed down through generations, help explain the mysteries of existence and provide models for how to live with courage and wisdom. Evening brings the community together again. As the sun sinks toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, people emerge from the heat drowsiness of afternoon. The evening meal is often a communal affair, with families gathering in courtyards or on rooftops to share food and conversation. The bread is fresh from the day's baking, perhaps accompanied by lentil stew, seasoned with herbs grown in small garden plots, or fish caught in the rivers and grilled over small fires. The sounds of evening are gentle and reassuring. The soft murmur of conversation, the laughter of children at play, the distant bleating of goats being led home from pasture, a splash of water as people perform their evening ablutions. Oil lamps begin to flicker to life, their warm glow pushing back the gathering darkness and creating pools of light where families gather. As night deepens, you might climb to your rooftop to escape the lingering heat of the day. Above you, the stars wheel in patterns that your people have learned to read like a vast celestial calendar. The constellations tell the farmer when to plant and harvest, guide the traveler across empty deserts, and reveal to the priests the will of the gods who govern all aspects of earthly life. The moon, when it appears, casts everything in silver light, the palm fronds stirring in the night breeze, the surface of the canals reflecting the stars, the stepped silhouettes of the ziggurats standing guard over the sleeping city. In the distance, you might hear the call of a night bird or the gentle splash of a fish jumping in the river, reminders that your human world exists within a larger tapestry of life. Sleep comes gradually, naturally, as the sounds of the city fade to whispers and the night air cools your skin. Tomorrow will bring the same rhythm of work and community, the same partnership between human effort and the life-giving waters that flow between the rivers. It's a rhythm that sustained your people for thousands of years, creating the foundation upon which all subsequent civilizations would build. In your dreams, you might walk again through fields of grain under an endless sky, or see the great king Gilgamesh striding through the gates of Uruk, or watch the morning sun illuminate the sacred steps of the ziggurat as priests climb toward heaven to speak with the gods on behalf of all humanity. This is the world the Sumerians created and inhabited, a world where human ingenuity first learned to shape nature to its needs, where the first cities rose from river mud, where writing first captured human thought in permanent form. Their daily lives lived with such care and attention to the rhythm of seasons and the flow of water, created the very concept of civilization itself. Let your mind drift now from the gentle rhythm of daily life to the grand halls of power, where kings walked among mortals, yet reached toward divinity. In the great city of Uruk, around 2700 BCE, there ruled a king whose name would echo through the millennia long after his mud-brick palace crumbled to dust. Gilgamesh, part man, part god, entirely human in his deepest longings and fears. Imagine yourself standing in the shadow of Uruk's massive walls, walls that stretched for 6 miles around the city and stood as tall as 6 men. These weren't merely defensive barriers. They were declarations written in brick and bitumen, proclaiming to all who approached that here dwelt a people who had mastered the arts of civilization. The walls bore the marks of Gilgamesh's ambition, each brick a testament to the labor of thousands, each tower a symbol of human determination to impose order upon the chaos of the world. Gilgamesh himself was a figure of contradictions, as all great leaders tend to be, standing 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal according to the ancient tales. He possessed strength that could fell cedar trees with his bare hands and beauty that made the goddess Ishtar herself desire him. Yet within this seemingly perfect exterior dwelt a restless spirit, a man driven by hungers that no amount of power or glory could satisfy. In the early years of his reign, Gilgamesh ruled with the passionate intensity of youth, unchecked by wisdom. He commanded the first right to every bride in his city, built monuments to his own glory with the sweat and blood of his subjects, and challenged the gods themselves with his arrogance. The people of Uruk, weary of their king's excesses, lifted their voices in prayer to the heavens, begging for relief from the very ruler who was supposed to protect them. The gods, in their wisdom, understood that Gilgash's greatest flaw was also his greatest strength. He was too much alone, too singular in his power, too isolated by his divine heritage from the common humanity he ruled. So they fashioned a companion, a wild man named Enkidu, formed from clay and river water, raised by gazelles in the wilderness, knowing nothing of cities or civilization or the complex yearnings that drive civilized hearts. Picture the first meeting between these two forces of nature: Gilgamesh, polished and powerful, adorned in the finest linens and gold of his kingdom, and Enkidu, naked and fierce, his hair long and matted, his body hardened by years of running with the wild herds across the steppes. They met not in friendship, but in combat, grappling like titans in the streets of Uruk, their struggles shaking the very foundations of buildings, their roars echoing off the ancient walls. But in that violent embrace, something unexpected occurred. As they tested each other's strength, pushing and straining with muscles corded like rope, they recognized something familiar in each other's eyes: the loneliness of exceptional beings, the burden of strength that sets one apart from ordinary mortals. When at last they could not overcome each other, they stepped back, breathing heavily, and in that moment of mutual respect, the greatest friendship in all of literature was born. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu embarked upon adventures that would be remembered for 4,000 years. They journeyed to the cedar forest, that distant realm where the trees grew tall enough to touch the sky and the guardian Humbaba prowled among the shadows. The forest was sacred to the gods, forbidden to mortals, but Gilgamesh's ambition knew no boundaries. He desired the cedar wood for his city, but more than that, he desired the glory that would come from defeating the seemingly undefeatable guardian. The journey itself was a test of endurance and friendship. They walked for days across barren landscapes, their water running low, their feet bloody from sharp stones, their resolve tested by the enormity of their undertaking. At night, they would lie side by side under stars that seemed cold and distant, sharing their fears and dreams in the way that only true friends in Humbaba, when they finally encountered him, was a creature of elemental terror. His voice was the roar of floodwaters. His breath was fire. His presence made the great cedars tremble. The battle was fierce and prolonged, with the guardian calling upon the powers of wind and storm to aid him. But friendship proved stronger than supernatural might, and together the two heroes brought down the ancient protector of the forest. Victory carried its own curse. The gods, angered by this violation of sacred boundaries, decreed that one of the two friends must die. Enkidu, the wild man who had learned to love civilization through his friendship with Gilgamesh, fell ill with a mysterious wasting disease. For days he lay fevered and delirious, his great strength ebbing like water poured onto thirsty sand. Gilgamesh tended his friend with desperate devotion, applying cool cloths to his burning forehead, offering the finest foods and wines, summoning the greatest healers in all of Mesopotamia. But mortal medicine could not contend with divine judgment, and slowly, inexorably, Enkidu slipped away from the world of the living. The scene of Enkidu's death became one of the most heartbreaking passages ever inscribed on clay tablets. Gilgamesh held his friend's hand as life departed, felt the final breath escape those familiar lips, saw the light fade from eyes that had looked upon him with such loyalty and understanding. For 7 days and 7 nights, the king refused to accept what had happened, talking to the still form as if Enkidu could still hear, bringing food and drink as if death were merely a temporary setback. Only when a worm emerged from Enkidu's nostril did the reality of mortality finally penetrate Gilgamesh's divine consciousness. His friend, his other self, his complement, his anchor to humanity, was truly gone. And with him went Gilgamesh's innocence regarding the inevitable fate that awaits all living things. Grief transformed the king as completely as if he had been reborn. He cast off his royal robes, dressed in the skins of lions, letting his hair grow wild, wandering the wilderness like a madman pursued by furies. But his madness had a purpose. He sought Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood, the one mortal who had been granted eternal life by the gods. If immortality existed for one human, perhaps it could be obtained by another, especially one with divine blood flowing in his veins. The journey to find Utnapishtim led Gilgamesh to the very edges of the world, through landscapes where no mortal was meant to walk. He crossed the waters of death, those treacherous seas that surrounded the realm of the immortals, navigating by stars that shone with cold, eternal light. He passed through tunnels of absolute darkness, where even his divine heritage could not provide light, feeling his way forward by touch alone, driven by a desperate hope that death might not be the final answer to existence. When at last he found Utnapishtim, the immortal flood survivor proved to be not the triumphant hero Gilgamesh had expected, but a weary ancient figure who spoke of immortality as a burden rather than a blessing. The old man told his story slowly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, how the gods had grown angry with humanity's noise and decided to cleanse the earth with flood, how he alone had been warned to build a great boat and save the animals, how he had watched the world drown from his ark's deck, while rain fell like spears from a gray and vengeful sky. Utnapishtim's immortality, he explained, had been granted as a unique exception, a reward for his service during humanity's darkest hour. It could not be transferred or earned through heroic deeds or divine parentage. Death, he said gently but firmly, was woven into the very fabric of mortal existence, as natural and necessary as sleep after a long day's labor. Yet the old man took pity on Gilgamesh's grief. He told the king of a plant that grew at the bottom of the deepest lake, a thorny weed that could restore youth to whoever consumed it. It was not immortality, but it was a kind of victory over time's relentless advance. Gilgamesh dove deep into the dark waters, his lungs burning, his hands torn by the plant's cruel spines, but he emerged triumphant, clutching the precious herb that seemed to pulse with life itself. The journey home was long and arduous, but Gilgamesh's heart was lighter than it had been since Enkidu's death. He planned to share the plant with his people, to bring the gift of renewed youth to all of Uruk. But the gods, it seemed, were not finished with their lessons. As Gilgamesh bathed in a cool spring during the heat of midday, a serpent emerged from the water and swallowed the plant of youth in a single gulp. The snake immediately shed its old skin, emerging renewed and gleaming, while Gilgamesh was left with nothing but the bitter knowledge of how close he had come to conquering time itself. In that moment of loss, something fundamental shifted within the king's understanding. He had sought to escape the human condition, to transcend the mortality that connected him to his subjects. But in doing so, he had missed the true meaning of his existence. Immortality was not the goal, legacy was not the preservation of the self, but the continuation of what one had built and loved and passed on to future generations. Gilgamesh returned to Uruk transformed once again, but this time the change was toward wisdom rather than away from it. He became a just and thoughtful ruler, one who understood that a king's true immortality lay not in his own endless existence, but in the prosperity and happiness of his people, in the strength of the walls he built to protect them, in the laws he established to govern them with fairness, in the stories they would tell of his reign long after his body had returned to the earth from which it came. The final tablets of his epic describe not great adventures or supernatural encounters, but the quieter victories of good governance. Gilgamesh, walking through his city's streets, listening to the concerns of merchants and farmers, observing the children at play, ensuring that the irrigation canals flowed properly, and that justice was dispensed fairly in the courts. He had learned that true heroism lay not in defying the gods or conquering impossible monsters, but in accepting the responsibilities that came with power and using that power to create something lasting and beautiful when death finally came. For Gilgamesh, as it comes for all mortals, regardless of their divine heritage, he faced it with the calm dignity of one who had made peace with the fundamental nature of existence. His people mourned him genuinely, not as subjects who had lost a master, but as citizens who had lost a protector and guide. They buried him with honor, but more importantly, they continued the work he had begun, maintaining the walls, preserving the laws, telling the stories that kept his memory alive. The Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed on clay tablets and preserved in the libraries of ancient kings, became one of humanity's first great meditations on the meaning of life and the inevitability of death. Its themes: friendship, loss, the search for meaning, the acceptance of mortality, resonated across cultures and centuries because they spoke to universal human experiences that transcend the boundaries of time and place. As you drift deeper into sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself standing once more on the walls of Uruk, looking out over the city that Gilgamesh built and ruled with such passionate intensity. The sun is setting, painting the mud brick buildings in shades of gold and rose, and in the gathering twilight, you can almost hear the echo of ancient voices, the merchants calling their wares, the children laughing at play, the priests chanting their evening prayers to gods, whose names are now forgotten by all but scholars. But the questions that drove Gilgamesh, how to live a meaningful life in the face of inevitable death, how to love fully knowing that loss awaits, how to build something lasting in a world where everything eventually crumbles to dust. These questions remain as relevant now as they were 4,000 years ago. In seeking answers to them, the king of Uruk became the first hero of world literature, and his story became a bridge connecting us across the vast gulf of centuries to the very dawn of human self-reflection. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, tested by adventure and sealed by loss, reminds us that our connections to others are what give meaning to our brief existence. The king's ultimate acceptance of mortality teaches us that wisdom lies not in raging against the limits of human life, but in embracing those limits and finding within them the motivation to create, to love, to build, and to leave the world a little better than we found it. Allow your mind to drift southward now, deeper into the misty realm where history dissolves into legend, and legend merges with the whispered secrets of the earth itself. Here, in the marshy delta where the great rivers finally surrender to the Persian Gulf, lies Eridu, the first city, according to Sumerian memory, the place where kingship first descended from heaven like gentle rain upon fertile soil. Imagine yourself approaching this ancient settlement in the pre-dawn darkness, when the boundary between dreams and waking blurs like watercolors bleeding into wet paper. The landscape around you is neither fully land nor fully water, but something more primal, a world of reed beds that whisper ancient secrets, of channels that wind like silver threads through dark earth, of islands that appear and disappear, with the rhythm of seasonal floods. The air here carries scents that speak of beginnings, the rich, organic perfume of river mud, pregnant with life, the green sweetness of new growth, the faint salt tang that hints at distant seas. This is not the ordered agricultural landscape of later Sumerian cities, but something wilder, more mysterious, a place where the first humans learned to coax, civilization from the marriage of earth and water. Eridu's ziggurat rises from this primal landscape like a mountain born from dreams, its stepped sides climbing toward a sky that seems both infinite and intimate in the pre-dawn light. But this is not merely another temple according to the most ancient Sumerian texts. This is where Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, first established his earthly dwelling. Here, in the deepest foundations of the temple, archaeologists have discovered something that makes even skeptical scholars pause in wonder. Evidence of continuous worship spanning over 4,000 years. Layer upon layer, the excavations reveal the patient accumulation of devotion. At the very bottom, archaeologists found simple reed huts where the earliest inhabitants gathered to honor their gods with offerings of fish and grain. Above that, modest mud brick shrines, their walls bearing the fingerprints of anonymous believers who shaped the clay with their own hands. Higher still, increasingly elaborate temples, each built directly atop its predecessor, creating a vertical timeline of human spiritual evolution. Picture yourself descending through these layers of time, each step carrying you deeper into humanity's collective memory. The pottery shards scattered through the ancient floors tell stories in their broken fragments, vessels that once held offerings of beer and honey, bowls that caught the sacred water used in purification rituals, cups that touch the lips of priests whose names are lost to time, but whose devotion is written in the patient accumulation of their offerings. The mystery of Eridu extends beyond its impressive longevity to the very nature of its founding. Unlike later Sumerian cities that grew from practical considerations, trade routes, defensive positions, agricultural advantages, Eridu seems to have been established for purely spiritual reasons. The site offers no particular strategic benefits, no exceptional natural resources, no obvious economic advantages. It exists because someone, or some group of someones, felt called to create a sacred space in this marshy borderland between order and chaos. The Sumerian king list, that ancient catalog of rulers that stretches back into the mists of time, begins with Eridu. After the kingship descended from heaven, the text intones, the kingship was in Eridu. But the kings it names for those earliest times ruled for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years each, according to the scribes who preserved these memories. These are not historical records in any sense we would recognize, but something deeper, mythic time, the eternal present in which all fundamental truths exist simultaneously. Modern archaeologists, sifting through the accumulated debris of millennia, have uncovered evidence that both supports and complicates these ancient claims. The earliest levels of Eridu do indeed seem associated with innovations that would become hallmarks of Sumerian civilization: sophisticated pottery, complex religious rituals, the beginnings of writing. But they also reveal something more mysterious: signs of contact with peoples and cultures that left no other trace in the archaeological record. Strange pottery styles appear briefly in the deepest layers, bearing decorative motifs that seem to have no antecedents in the region and no descendants in later Sumerian art. Tools made from stones that don't occur naturally anywhere in Mesopotamia suggest trade networks or population movements that remain invisible to conventional historical analysis. Most intriguingly, some of the earliest cuneiform tablets from Eridu contain symbols and combinations of symbols that don't appear in any other Sumerian texts, as if they preserve fragments of a writing system that was already ancient when the scribes learned to use it. The god Enki, who made Eridu his earthly home, embodies these mysteries in his very nature. Unlike the storm gods and war gods who dominate many ancient pantheons, Enki was associated with wisdom, fresh water, and the arts of civilization. The myths describe him as a crafty, benevolent deity who often sided with humanity against the harsher judgments of other gods. When the great flood was decreed to cleanse the earth of noisy mortals, it was Enki who whispered warnings to the faithful Utnapishtim, enabling him to build his ark and preserve life through the deluge. Enki's wisdom had a darker aspect that the myths only hint at in passing. He was said to know secrets that even the other gods found disturbing. To understand mysteries that connected the ordered world of civilization to the chaos that always threatens to reclaim it. In the deepest chambers of his temple at Eridu, Priests performed rituals whose exact nature remains unknown, ceremonies that were said to maintain the delicate balance between cosmos and chaos, between the creative and destructive forces that shape all existence. The archaeological evidence from these deepest chambers is tantalizing and incomplete. Excavators have found elaborate drainage systems that seem to serve no practical purpose, channels and basins carved from stone and lined with bitumen, designed to carry water through complex patterns beneath the temple floors. Some scholars suggest these were used for ritual purification ceremonies, but the systems are far more elaborate than any known purification rites would require. Even more mysterious are the sealed chambers discovered in recent decades, rooms deep within the ziggurats foundations that appear to have been deliberately walled up in ancient times. X-ray examinations reveal the presence of objects within large pottery vessels, wooden chests, what appear to be scroll-like objects that might be leather or papyrus. But the chambers cannot be opened without risking the structural integrity of the entire temple complex, so their contents remain as secret today as they were when ancient priests sealed them away. The water cult of Eridu extended far beyond the temple itself, encompassing the entire sacred landscape of marshes and channels that surrounded the city. The ancient Sumerians understood something that modern environmentalists are only beginning to rediscover, that wetlands are among the most productive and diverse ecosystems on Earth, cradles of life that support an extraordinary abundance of plants and animals dot in the marshes around Eridu. The Sumerians developed a way of life that was simultaneously primitive and sophisticated, dependent on intimate knowledge of natural cycles and seasonal changes. They built floating gardens on mats of woven reeds, creating fertile plots that rose and fell with the water levels. They domesticated water buffalo, whose milk and meat supplemented the fish and waterfowl that teemed in the channels. They harvested the reeds themselves for construction material, weaving them into houses that could be disassembled and moved when the water shifted. This marsh culture produced some of the most beautiful artifacts ever found in Mesopotamia intricately carved ivory pieces that depict the plants and animals of the wetlands with stunning naturalistic detail, golden vessels shaped like water birds, jewelry that incorporates freshwater pearls and shells from distant seas. These objects suggest a people who found the sacred in the natural world around them, who saw divinity not only in the ordered spaces of temples and cities, but in the wild abundance of untamed nature. The mystery deepens when we consider the language preserved in the oldest texts from Eridu. While most early Sumerian writing deals with practical matters, business transactions, legal contracts, administrative records, the religious texts from Eridu contain words and phrases that don't appear anywhere else in the Sumerian language. Some scholars believe these represent fragments of an even older language, perhaps the original tongue of the marsh dwellers who first settled the site. These linguistic puzzles extend to the names of the gods and goddesses worshipped at Eridu. While deities like Enki eventually became part of the standard Sumerian pantheon, their earliest appearances at Eridu show them with different names, different attributes, different mythological associations. It's as if the religious traditions preserved at this ancient site represent a stream of spiritual understanding that flowed into later Sumerian culture from sources we can no longer identify. The calendar systems used at Eridu also show peculiar features that set them apart from the standardized calendars used in other Sumerian cities. While most Mesopotamian cultures based their calendars on lunar cycles, with periodic adjustments to keep them aligned with the solar year, the Eridu calendar seems to have incorporated stellar observations that don't correspond to any known astronomical traditions from the region. Clay tablets from the temple archives record observations of star positions, planetary movements, and celestial events with precision that suggests generations of careful skywatching. But the purposes to which these observations were put remain unclear. Unlike the astrological texts from later periods, which focus on predicting earthly events based on heavenly movements, the Eridu astronomical records seem more concerned with maintaining some kind of temporal rhythm, as if the priests were tracking celestial cycles for reasons that transcended mere fortune telling. The burial practices at Eridu also reveal mysteries that have never been satisfactorily explained. In the cemetery areas surrounding the temple complex, archaeologists have found graves that span thousands of years, showing a continuous tradition of honoring the dead that persisted through multiple cultural changes and political upheavals. But scattered among the conventional burials are more unusual interments, bodies buried in pottery vessels, graves filled with water rather than earth, skeletal remains that show evidence of ritual modification that doesn't match any known Mesopotamian burial customs. Some of these unusual burials contain grave goods that seem to come from impossible distances: seashells from the Indian Ocean, amber from the Baltic, jade from Central Asia. These materials could not have reached Eridu through the trade networks documented by historical sources, suggesting either contact with unknown cultures or the preservation of objects whose origins had been forgotten by the time they were buried. Perhaps most mysteriously, several burials contain what appear to be maps or diagrams etched onto metal plates. These images show waterways and landforms that don't correspond to any known geography, but their style and execution suggest they were created with the same careful attention to detail that characterizes other Sumerian artwork. Some scholars have suggested they might represent the landscape of Eridu as it existed in earlier geological periods, when sea levels and river courses were different from their current positions. The decline of Eridu is as mysterious as its origins. Sometime around 2000 BCE, the great temple complex was gradually abandoned, not through conquest or natural disaster, but through what appears to have been a deliberate withdrawal. The latest texts from the site speak of the god Enki departing from his earthly dwelling, taking his wisdom to other realms beyond human reach. Archaeological evidence suggests that the abandonment was careful and methodical. Valuable objects were removed, important texts were transferred to other temple libraries, and the sacred chambers were sealed with a precision that suggests long planning rather than hasty evacuation. It's as if the keepers of Eridu's mysteries decided that the time had come to preserve their secrets elsewhere, leaving behind only hints and fragments for future generations to puzzle over. Today, the ruins of Eridu rise from the desert like the bones of some enormous creature, worn smooth by wind and sand, but still recognizable in their essential outlines. The marshes that once surrounded the city have largely dried up, victims of modern dam construction and irrigation projects. But in the early morning light, when the desert air shimmers with heat and the horizon blurs between earth and sky, it's still possible to imagine the landscape as it once was, a place where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was as fluid as the waters that nourished it. The mystery of Eridu reminds us that the origins of human civilization may be far more complex and fascinating than our conventional history suggests. Here, in this ancient city that existed at the very dawn of recorded time, we find evidence of knowledge and practices that don't fit neatly into our understanding of how cultures develop and change. The people who built and maintained Eridu for over 4 millennia possessed secrets that they chose to preserve in forms we can recognize but cannot fully decipher. As you drift deeper into sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself walking through the ruined halls of Enki's temple, your footsteps echoing in chambers where priests once performed rituals whose purposes are lost to time. The air around you carries whispers of ancient languages, fragments of prayers offered to gods whose names are carved in stone, but whose true nature remains. Hidden behind veils of myth and mystery. In the silence of the desert night, you might almost hear the distant sound of water lapping against reed beds, the call of marsh birds that no longer visit this dry landscape. the gentle splash of oars as the ancient people of Eridu move through their watery world, like spirits navigating. Between the realms of earth and heaven, the mystery of Eridu is not one that will ever be fully solved, and perhaps that's as it should be. Some knowledge is meant to remain hidden. Some secrets are too profound for ordinary understanding. But in the very existence of this ancient city, in the patient devotion of the people who maintained it for so many centuries, we find proof that human beings have always sensed that there is more to existence than what meets the eye, more to the world than what can be measured and catalogued, and explained as the night deepens around you and your breathing becomes slower, more rhythmic. Let your mind ascend now from the mysteries of ancient Eridu to the gleaming heights of Sumerian society, where priests and nobles lived lives of privilege and responsibility, caught between the demands of gods and the needs of mortals. In the great city of Ur, around 2500 BCE, imagine yourself walking through the sacred precincts where power was both earthly and divine, where every decision rippled outward through layers of society like stones cast into still water. The morning begins before dawn in the quarters of the high priestess Enhejuana, daughter of King Sargon, poet and keeper of sacred mysteries. Her dwelling occupies the upper levels of the great ziggurat of Nana, the moon god, its rooms decorated with walls of blue glazed brick that seem to capture starlight even in the darkness before sunrise. The air here is perfumed with frankincense and myrrh, precious resins carried from distant lands by merchants who understand that the favor of the gods requires offerings worthy of their divine nature. And Enhejuana awakens not to the crow of roosters or the bustle of common folk, but to the soft chiming of bronze bells that mark the sacred hours. Her servant girls, chosen from noble families and trained in the intricate rituals of temple service, approach with vessels of warm water, scented with rose petals, silk cloths for drawing, and the elaborate garments that mark her status as intermediary. Between heaven and earth, the process of dressing is itself a ritual, each garment imbued with symbolic meaning. The linen underrobe, white as moonlight, represents purity of spirit. Over this goes a robe of deep blue wool, dyed with lapis lazuli. Powder, symbolizing the night sky over which Nana holds dominion. Golden jewelry adorns her throat and wrists, not mere decoration, but sacred regalia that channels divine power and marks her as separate from ordinary mortals. As she prepares for the day's ceremonies, Enhejuana reviews the clay tablets that record the temple's business, not just religious matters, but the complex economic activities that make her one of the most powerful people in the city. The Temple of Nana owns vast estates, worked by hundreds of laborers, herds of cattle, and sheep that number in the thousands. Workshops where skilled artisans create goods for both local use and distant trade. The wealth that flows through the temple represents more than mere accumulation. It is the visible manifestation of divine blessing, proof that the gods approve of the city's devotion and the priest's faithful service. Every offering brought by worshippers, every tribute paid by subordinate settlements, every profit from temple-sponsored trade expeditions confirms the cosmic order that places the gods above mortals and their chosen servants above ordinary citizens. But with this privilege comes a burden that weighs heavily on souls sensitive to the movements of divine will. Enhejuana must interpret the dreams sent by Nana, must read meaning in the flight patterns of birds, must divine the gods' intentions from the shapes formed by oil poured on water. The people of Ur depend on her ability to understand heaven's messages, to know when to plant and when to harvest, when to wage war and when to make peace, when the gods are pleased and when they require additional offerings to maintain their favor. Her morning begins with a ritual of purification, a complex ceremony that prepares her to enter the god's presence. In a chamber deep within the ziggurat, she bathes in water that has been blessed with prayers and perfumed with sacred oils. The water must be drawn from 7 different sources: the river, a well, a spring, a pond, rain collected in silver vessels, dew gathered from temple gardens, and water that has stood overnight under the open sky to absorb the moon's influence. As she immerses herself in this sacred mixture, Enheduanna recites prayers whose words are so ancient that their meanings have become more mystical than literal. These are not the practical prayers of farmers asking for good crops or merchants seeking profitable ventures, but rather invocations that seem to reach toward the fundamental forces that hold the universe together. Words that acknowledge the mystery at the heart of existence and humanity's small place within it. The temple, complex around her, awakens gradually to the rhythm of sacred duty. Lesser priests and priestesses emerge from their quarters, each with specific roles to play in the day's ceremonies. The singers practice hymns whose melodies date back to the earliest days of the city, their voices blending in harmonies that seem to make the very air shimmer with spiritual energy. And musicians tune their lyres and drums, preparing to provide the rhythmic foundation that will carry prayers upward to divine ears. In the temple workshops, skilled artisans continue work that never truly ends, the creation of objects beautiful enough to please the gods. Goldsmiths shape precious metal into vessels and ornaments, their hammers ringing with a rhythm that matches the beating of devout hearts. Weavers work threads of gold and silver into fabrics that catch and reflect light like captured sunshine. Stone carvers shape images of gods and heroes with such skill that the finished statues seem to breathe with life, barely held in check. The contrast between these sacred precincts and the ordinary city below is striking, but not absolute. Wealth and privilege create distance, but they do not entirely separate the priestly class from the people they serve. Enheduanna's poetry, which will survive for thousands of years as the world's first authored literature, speaks not only of divine mysteries, but of very human emotions: love and loss, hope and fear, the universal experiences that connect all hearts regardless of social station. The morning ritual of feeding the god requires processions of servants carrying offerings that represent the city's abundance. Golden bowls filled with honey, silver platters laden with the finest bread, pitchers of beer so perfect it foams like clouds, roasted meats from animals whose lives were taken with prayers of gratitude and respect. These offerings are arranged before the god's statue with choreographed precision, each item placed according to traditions that stretch back through generations of devoted service. But the god does not consume these offerings in any literal sense. Instead, they are later distributed to the temple staff and to the poor who gather at the temple gates, creating a system of redistribution that ensures no one in the city goes hungry while the temples overflow with abundance. This practical charity is understood as part of the cosmic order, a way of maintaining the balance between divine blessing and human need. The noble families of yore live in a different kind of luxury, earthly rather than sacred, but no less elaborate in its displays of wealth and power. Imagine yourself entering the palace of a high-ranking administrator, a man whose family has served the royal household for generations, and whose accumulated wealth rivals that of many temples. His house is built around courtyards where fountains splash softly day and night, their sound creating pockets of coolness in the desert heat. The walls are decorated with elaborate frescoes that depict scenes from mythology and history: Gilgamesh wrestling with lions, Inanna descending into the underworld, great battles where gods and heroes determine the fate of cities. These images serve not merely as decoration, but as constant reminders of the stories that give meaning to Sumerian life. The furniture in these noble households represents the pinnacle of craftsmen's skill: chairs inlaid with ivory and shell, tables supported by legs carved in the shape of bulls and lions, chests decorated with complex patterns that seem to shift and change as candlelight flickers across their surfaces. Carpets from distant lands cover floors of polished stone, their colors so rich and patterns so intricate that walking on them seems almost sacrilegious. The daily life of noble families revolves around the complex social rituals that maintain their status and reinforce the hierarchies that structure Sumerian society. Meals become ceremonies where the arrangement of guests, the order of service, and the choice of foods all carry messages about relationships and obligations. Conversations touch on politics and business, but always with a careful indirection that prevents the speaking of dangerous truths too directly. Children in these households are raised by servants and tutors who understand that their charges are being prepared for positions of responsibility and power. The boys learn to read and write, to calculate and negotiate, to understand the complex web of laws and customs that govern civilized behavior. They study the great literary works, memorizing passages from Gilgamesh and other classics, developing the cultural sophistication that marks them as members of the educated elite. The girls receive equally careful education, though focused on different skills: the management of large households, the supervision of servants, the subtle arts of diplomacy that allow them to influence political decisions while maintaining the appearance of feminine submission. Many learn to read and write as well, and some, like in Edgewana, achieve fame for their literary and intellectual accomplishments. But privilege in Sumerian society comes with its own forms of constraint and danger. Noble families must navigate the treacherous currents of court politics, where a misplaced word or inappropriate alliance can lead to disgrace, exile, or worse. They must maintain their wealth through careful management and shrewd investment, understanding that economic failure can destroy a family's status as completely as political miscalculation. The pressure to maintain appearances requires constant vigilance and considerable expense. Noble households must be staffed with numerous servants, not just for practical purposes, but as visible demonstrations of their master's importance. They must host elaborate banquets and give generous gifts, must dress in the finest clothes and own the most beautiful objects, must surround themselves with the luxury that signals their place in the social hierarchy. The relationship between nobles and priests is complex, involving both cooperation and competition. Many noble families have members who serve in temple hierarchies, creating networks of mutual obligation and shared interest. Temple lands are often managed by noble administrators, while priestly families accumulate earthly wealth through their spiritual responsibilities. Marriage alliances between priestly and noble houses are common, binding the two elites together, while maintaining the distinction between sacred and secular authority. Yet tensions exist as well. Nobles sometimes chafe under the moral authority of priests, feeling that religious leaders intrude too much into worldly affairs. Priests, for their part, may disapprove of the nobles' pursuit of luxury and their occasional disregard for religious obligations. These tensions rarely break into open conflict, but they create an undercurrent of competition that adds complexity to the upper reaches of Sumerian society. The evening hours in these privileged households are times of refined pleasure and cultural sophistication. Musicians perform in torchlit courtyards, their songs telling stories of love and heroism, their melodies carrying listeners beyond the concerns of daily life into realms of beauty and imagination. Poets recite new compositions or classic works, their voices rising and falling with rhythms that seem to match the beating of attentive hearts. Games of strategy are popular entertainment board games, played with carved pieces on boards inlaid with precious stones. Contests of wit and memory that allow players to display their intelligence and education. These games often serve social functions as well, providing opportunities for negotiation and alliance building disguised as friendly competition.